Consider what it means when the world's largest humanitarian organization interrupts its own silence. The United Nations World Food Program does not issue warnings lightly. It is a body that deals in logistics, ships, trucks, warehouses, metric tons. It counts calories the way an accountant counts debt, because the math is what matters. And the math eventually tells you when a system is about to fail. So when the WFP goes on record and says that a prolonged military conflict between the United States and Iran could push millions of additional people into acute hunger, not hunger as a chronic condition, but the acute kind, the kind that kills, that is not a press release, that is a distress signal. Here's what we know. The WFP warning centers on one mechanism above all others: oil prices. Not the conflict itself, not missiles or sanctions in isolation, but what a sustained U.S.-Iran confrontation does to the price of energy moving through the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway that handles roughly 20% of the world's traded oil. You close that passage, or you scare enough tankers away from it, and the price of everything goes up. Not just gas, not just heating bills. Everything that gets grown, processed, refrigerated, packaged, and shipped, which is to say, food. To understand why that matters, you have to understand who the world's most vulnerable food importers actually are. The countries that sit at the edge of the WFP's concern are not wealthy nations with strategic grain reserves and diversified supply chains. They are the ones that already import the majority of their calories. Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, the Horn of Africa. Yemen, which was already in a state of famine before the last decade of conflict stripped what remained of its agricultural infrastructure. These are places where a family's monthly food expenditure is not a line item. It is the budget. There is no surplus. There is no pivot. When the global price of wheat climbs 15% because oil shocks raised the cost of fertilizer, transport, and irrigation, a subsistence family in Somalia does not tighten a belt. There is no belt, and the U.S.-Iran relationship has been building toward a flashpoint for a very long time. The history here is not simple, and anyone who tells you it is has an agenda. What we can say is this. Since the 1979 revolution, the United States and Iran have existed in a state of managed hostility, not quite war, but never peace. The Islamic Republic's nuclear program, its proxy networks across Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen, its Revolutionary Guard operations, and the American response to all of it. Sanctions, military posturing, targeted killings. This has been the architecture of a conflict that has never fully declared itself. The 2020 killing of General Qasem Soleimani brought the two countries closer to open war than at and any point in 40 years. The region did not forget. Now consider the current trajectory. American military presence in the Middle East is not shrinking. Iranian uranium enrichment has, by multiple independent assessments, reached levels that would allow a weapons-grade breakout within a matter of weeks, not months. Proxy engagements between Iranian-backed forces and American assets continue with a regularity that barely makes headlines anymore, because we have collectively normalized what would have once been considered acts of war. The Houthis, Hezbollah, militia forces in Iraq. These are not separate stories. They are theaters in the same production. Here's what the paper trail actually shows. The WFP's internal modeling, corroborated by the World Bank's Food Price Volatility Index and the Food and Agriculture Organization's commodity reports, draws a direct line from oil price shocks to food security collapses. The 2008 financial crisis offers the clearest historical case. When Brent crude spiked above $140 per barrel, food riots broke out in over 40 countries. The Arab Spring, the one that toppled governments across the region starting in 2010, was triggered not only by political grievance, but by a spike in global wheat and bread prices that made daily life economically intolerable for millions of people in the Arab world. That is not a metaphor. That is documented causation. The WFP's current warning is that a sustained U.S.-Iran conflict would push oil prices to levels not seen since the post-invasion Iraq period at minimum and potentially far higher if the Strait of Hormuz were disrupted. Their models suggest an additional 30 to 50 million people could fall into acute food insecurity. Acute. The word matters. This is not a projection about long-term undernourishment trends. This is a projection about the number of people who would not have enough to eat within months of a conflict's escalation. 30 to 50 million people. Notice that number. Notice it the way you would notice a fire alarm rather than a news ticker. And here is the part that should concern all of us. The geopolitical conversation around a potential U.S.-Iran conflict is conducted almost entirely in the language of security. Deterrence, red lines, regional stability, ballistic missile range, naval blockade capability. These are real considerations. They are not the wrong frame, but they are an incomplete frame because they do not account for the second-order casualties, the people who will not die in an airstrike, but who will experience the consequences of that airstrike in the price of a bag of flour 6,000 miles away from the nearest theater of frauta. We have a long history of making military and foreign policy decisions while treating the global food supply as an externality, something that sorts itself out, something that humanitarian organizations will manage, something that doesn't belong in the room where the security decisions are made. The WFP warning is, in part, a demand to be in that room. The broader argument embedded in that warning is one that multilateral institutions have been making for years without breaking through to the rooms where it matters. That a world of interconnected supply chains, where energy prices move, food prices, move political stability, move conflict risk, cannot be navigated with a security framework designed for a world of separate, bounded national economies. It is a systems argument. It is also, increasingly, a survival argument. Two threads remain unresolved here. The first is whether the diplomatic channels that might prevent an escalation are still functional. Back-channel communications between Washington and Tehran have existed in various forms for years, through Oman, through European intermediaries, through quiet UN facilitation. Whether any of those channels are currently active, and whether they carry the weight that the moment requires, is not something anyone is confirming publicly. That silence is itself a data point. The second is a structural question that no one has fully answered. If a conflict does happen, and the food crisis the WFP is describing does materialize, what is the actual mechanism by which that gets addressed? The WFP is funded by voluntary contributions from member states, the largest of which is the United States. A country at war, facing domestic economic pressure from its own energy prices, does not historically increase its humanitarian contributions. The math, at that point, becomes very difficult. Hunger has never been an accident. It has always been a policy outcome, with policy causes and policy solutions if the will to find them exists.